Good. How are you?
Good.
Welcome, Dr. Tessa Cook. Tessa is a cardiovascular radiologist. She's an associate professor of radiology at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the vice chair of practice transformation radiology. Tessa specializes in imaging informatics and clinical innovation with a focus on using technology and data to improve radiology workflows, patient care, and medical education. Welcome, Tessa.
Thank you, Brandon. Great to be here.
So, can we start by learning a little bit more about radiology, just generally? What is cardiovascular radiology?
So, cardiovascular radiology is a subspecialty of diagnostic radiology that primarily deals with the heart and the blood vessels. I joke that in my practice, we draw this sort of arbitrary line at the clavicles, at the collarbone, and everything above the collarbone belongs to my colleagues in neuroradiology, and everything below the collarbone, including all the way down to the toes, belongs to me in
Oh,
cardiovascular imaging. So we do all the vascular imaging for, the body, for the extremities, and we do all of the cardiac imaging, specifically cardiac CT and cardiac MRI, for heart and heart related issues. And everybody kind of draws those lines as to, what belongs to whom in slightly different ways, but that's the way that we do it here in our practice. So,
okay.
we're responsible for all sorts of things. Preoperative planning, pre-procedural planning, postoperative evaluation, looking at quantifying risk for cardiovascular disease, quantifying current cardiovascular disease, looking at, trying to figure out whether patients need lifestyle modification, medication, cardiology consultation, thoracic surgery consultation.
Okay.
Sometimes it's just follow up. Patients have risk factors for various conditions, and we just want to make sure nothing is getting any worse, or if things are starting to progress, that we get them in front of a surgeon or someone else who can help. So it's one of the areas in radiology where there's a lot of software too, which is one of the
Yeah.
things that drew me to it. So it fits very nicely with all of my other interests.
Okay. So, what is imaging informatics and how does it relate to radiology?
So, imaging informatics is really the field that deals with all of the data and systems and interfaces that we have in radiology. And so, it's everything from figuring out, how the clinical day is going to proceed smoothly, how all of the systems that we have to
Mm.
interact with, from the electronic health record, which is, universally used in the hospital and in the outpatient setting, to the radiology specific systems, PACS, for example, which is where we view our images, the radiology information system, which is sort of this enormous database of everything to do with our patients as pertains to radiology, the all the various post-processing software that we use to do 3D modeling, vascular planning, post-processing for surgical procedures. All of it has to interact in a way that is seamless and that preserves the data integrity, so that everything for a particular patient follows that patient through the care process. So the fundamental part of it is making the clinical day go smoothly, making sure everything talks to everything else. But even more than that, it's an opportunity for us to innovate and to build new things and to come up with better ways to deliver care. AI is certainly a huge part of that these days. But imaging informatics also doesn't live within just radiology, right? Imaging doesn't live just within
Right.
radiology. In healthcare, there is imaging in cardiology, digital pathology, dermatology, ophthalmology, in the operating room. So imaging informatics really touches all areas of imaging in healthcare, and enterprise imaging, which is what we think of it as when it's not just imaging within radiology, is an enormous part of informatics right now. So it's sort of the ongoing hot topics that we have in the field: workflow, enterprise imaging, AI.
I love this. I'm already learning a lot. So, imaging informatics is, if I had to summarize, is the data and the systems around radiology,
Around imaging, exactly.
around imaging for radiology.
Around
Okay.
imaging. The data, the systems, the interfaces, interoperability is another really big thing that we
Okay.
focus on, because in the early days of radiology specifically, which is where imaging really began, everything was proprietary. If you bought a CT scanner from one vendor, they had one format. If you bought an X-ray machine from another vendor, they had another format.
Oh,
And one of the earliest things that we had to do as a specialty was come up with a standard by which information could be communicated across systems. And that for imaging data, specifically for the actual images themselves, was DICOM. So,
okay.
there is an international standard now for everything you might want to do with a medical image. And the manufacturers follow it, the software developers follow it. There's an expectation that, if you buy a certain kind of system, that it is DICOM conformant. And other standards have followed since then for other things that we do.
So this might be kind of a broad question, but what does the typical radiology workflow look like? Let's say I need imaging for something. What is the workflow? I come in, you take images. What's the process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and what you're describing is sort of diagnostic radiology versus interventional radiology. So,
Sure.
so I'll explain that distinction first because the workflows are different.
Okay.
I am a diagnostic radiologist, so I
Ah,
don't
okay.
stick needles or catheters or things in patients typically. But my colleagues in interventional radiology are essentially doing image-guided surgery. Non-invasive image-guided surgery is probably the easiest way to think about it. So they can actually treat certain
Hmm.
conditions, everything from, vascular disease, if you have an aneurysm of your aorta, for example, to, very sophisticated therapies for different kinds of cancers. So that's the interventional side. On the
Okay.
diagnostic side, the workflow is typically, as you said, you might see a doctor and they might say, oh, you need an imaging test. And so what comes next?
Hmm.
Typically they have to, and it all starts with an order. So, so that is actually an area where, from an innovation standpoint, we encounter some challenges, but we can talk about that later. So, that doctor will go into the electronic health record and they will place an order for an imaging exam.
Mm,
And they typically have to tell the site that is performing the exam why they want it.
okay.
And that reason for exam, that indication, if you will, has multiple implications. It is communication to the imaging facility as to how they might perform the study. It is communication to the radiologist that eventually interprets the exam to help us understand what the clinician is looking for.
Okay.
Uh, for better or worse, in the US, it is communication to the insurance company in a way for them to decide whether they will cover the imaging exam or not. So it is a means of communication. And so once the order exists, the patient then has to schedule it somewhere.
Okay.
And depending on what kind of test it is, there might be, fewer sites that perform it compared to others. So
Right.
again, cardiovascular radiologist, cardiac MRI is not something that is done universally everywhere. You need techs who are trained to perform it. You need physicians who are trained to interpret it. So depending on where the exam ultimately gets scheduled, the patient might have some sort of prep that they have to do in advance. They might have to fast for a few hours. There are some very specific types of cardiac imaging where you try to increase glucose metabolism or suppress glucose metabolism so that when you
Okay.
show up for the test, you are capturing certain kinds of information. So there might be a little preparation involved. But typically, the patient then shows up on the day. They are, given some instructions, perhaps on, how to dress, if it's MRI versus CT versus something else. If there's metal, if it's MRI, you have to be careful about metal in the scanner and things
Okay.
like that. There might be some contraindications, again, depending on the type of test. But typically then the images are, you meet a technologist who actually operates the scanner and acquires the images. There has often been input from a radiologist prior to that point to make sure that we're doing the test in the right way to answer the
Okay.
clinical question. And then the images exist, right? And so they exist then on the computer that is attached to the scanner. So then they go from that computer typically to a short-term archive and sometimes also to a long-term archive. The shorter-term archive is what I referred to earlier, which is PACS, which is the Picture Archiving and Communications System. And that is one of the workhorse tools for a diagnostic radiologist. I sit down on a clinical day in the morning. I've got PACS, I've got my reporting software, I've got my RIS, my radiology information system, I've got my EHR.
Okay.
All of those things are sort of the core tools of a diagnostic radiologist. For me, with cardiovascular imaging, then there are all these other post-processing tools that come in, all of this additional software that we use to analyze both qualitatively and quantitatively the images. And then the interpretation is issued by voice recognition. So we actually dictate
Oh,
into a dictaphone. Mine is
okay.
hanging. And then we edit and we send that report out back into the medical record. Oftentimes there's communication with the ordering team, either by way of, hey, there's something here that needs follow-up, or, they might reach out and say, I have a question about something in the report. So there's often a lot of back and forth in terms of communication as well that is happening behind the scenes, that just that final, report interpretation kind of doesn't reveal as much.
Mhm. Okay. Thanks for going through that. That makes a lot of sense. What is your current role as vice chair of practice transformation in the Department of Radiology involve?
So I run a very small innovation hub in the Department of Radiology. Very small. I would
Okay.
love to grow it. If anybody out there is looking for a job, as soon as I have a job to offer you. But I have a couple of developers, a data analyst, and a coordinator, and we are the department's innovation center. So we have built solutions that live outside of, what I just described to you as the radiologist kind of core set of software applications, right?
Hmm.
But everything from tools that support downstream patient care. So, closing the loop on follow-up recommendations and imaging, trying to improve rates of imaging-based screenings, things that are not sort of, I don't know, mainstream is perhaps not the right word, but things that are less mature. So,
Okay.
mammography is very mature, right? It's federally mandated. It's been around for a long time. There are other conditions for which imaging based screening recommendations exist, but are perhaps less well known.
Okay.
Lung cancer screening is slowly starting to take effect. We built a whole program around liver cancer screening, but we built a platform really that then was used for precision medicine applications in the cancer center. We've built a lot of tools that support radiology resident education. We are building and now exploring a lot of AI related solutions, both commercially available as well as in-house, looking at how we can use large language models now to support education, to support practice, all of it. And so as the vice chair of practice transformation for the Department of Radiology, it's my role to identify these use cases, to entertain, possible ideas that are brought to us as well, and to be able to build out these new innovations that tie into the systems that we use clinically, but don't necessarily live within those systems.
Yeah, that was my next question is how do you decide what to research, what to prioritize? Like there's all these ideas, right? These things you're working on to enhance the process in different ways, like AI. Okay, for example, like there's so many opportunities there. Like how do you decide what your team is going to work on?
Yeah, it's really challenging, especially now and especially with a very small team. A few of these things we inherited and have continued to support over the years, but primarily it has to have, a direct impact. There has to be sort of a direct downstream benefit to
Yeah.
somebody, whether it's the patient, whether it's my colleagues, whether it's our residents and fellows that we're training, something that, hey, this is a cool idea. I generally have
Right.
one of the brilliant students that I work with
Yeah,
work on that kind of stuff, right?
I see.
And I also have informatics fellows. And so if it's hey, this sounds interesting, that is a different priority
Okay.
than, hey, we need this to really make a change somewhere, whether it's, efficiency, quality and safety, or something that can really have a potential impact.
And do these different things affect the diagnostic radiology process in different ways? So you started with like ordering, scheduling. prep, imaging, interpretation. You're thinking about ways of improving that process along the way, those different phases.
Exactly. So, I'll give you an example. We started out now, gosh, it's been over 10 years ago. We started working on a process to really discreetly identify follow-up recommendations in
Oh,
radiology reports because, I on my clinical days, I issue an interpretation for a set of images, again, cardiovascular, right? So usually someone has done this study to look at the blood vessels in a particular region in the body. But there are other organs in those same body regions. And so, it's not uncommon for us to find lung nodules, spots in the lungs that, could be benign or it could be early future cancers.
mhm.
And there are evidence-based guidelines around what you do when you find something like that.
Okay.
But the clinician that ordered the study isn't looking for the lung nodule. They're probably looking to see what size, whether or not the patient has an aortic aneurysm.
Right.
But I can't ignore the lung nodule just because that wasn't part of the clinical question. And so there's downstream testing that has to happen. But oftentimes, what we found years ago, and this still happens, I won't pretend that this is a solved problem, but we found that, those follow-up recommendations would sometimes get lost in the shuffle.
Okay.
And especially if it's something that's, a new cancer, you don't want that to get lost in the shuffle. And so we developed a whole system around identifying these, nudging the clinicians, and trying to increase the number of patients that got the recommended follow-up.
I
But
see.
that also is tricky sometimes because we don't necessarily know everything about the patient. It's a little bit different now in the era of the electronic medical record. But when I started in medicine, we had paper charts,
Yeah.
right? So if the chart was, in somewhere in the hospital on the floor, because the patient, not on the floor, but on the hospital, on the hospital floor, because that's where the patient's room was during their admission,
Yeah.
or it was in an office somewhere because that's where their primary care doctor was. There was information there that wasn't available to me.
Uh,
That still happens because patients don't just go to one doctor and one health system, right? It would be wonderful if we knew everything about everybody, but the reality is that care is obtained in different places, and sometimes we don't know the whole story. And so it was hard to sometimes close the loop because we didn't know if it had been done elsewhere, and it requires a lot of deliberate communication. So we've tried to, and we're continuing to innovate. We have a new one of our systems that we built has now been adopted by the health system and is being scaled across the enterprise with appropriate resourcing, which is really exciting because that's
mhm.
another thing that's really hard with a lot of what we build in the Center for Practice Transformation is for it to really be impactful, it needs a bigger team than us,
Right.
right? And some things you can get buy-in to scale, some things you can't. And so that's where these things kind of plug into the clinical workflow, but it's triggered by the radiologist in this case, right? They issue a recommendation, they flag a report, and we can kind of take it from there.
See.
Um, Another really neat thing that we built recently, which I have referred to now for many years as my white whale project because I have wanted to build this, no joke, for 10 years, and I'm so
Mhm.
excited that we finally did it. It's very simple. It's, you know what? If I'm reading a case and I find something interesting or I want to know what happens to this patient after I've signed the report and sent them on their way, I can hit a button in PACS and it gets filed for me in this external system that we're calling the portal because I haven't had time to go ask ChatGPT for a more creative name. Uh, and we now will alert that radiologist when the patient gets follow-up imaging, or maybe they go and have a biopsy and they get a pathology result. So we're actually giving people feedback automatically. Hey, remember this case you flagged 3 months ago? The patient had a follow-up. If you're curious to see it, just go click here and see what they got. Or, you read the study last week and they decided to biopsy whatever you described. Here's what the pathology result says. We used to, I have colleagues that walk around, some of them still, with index cards in their shirt pockets, right?
So,
And every time there's an interesting finding, they fish out an index card, write it down, stick it back in the pocket. That wouldn't work for me. I would lose all of those index cards,
yeah.
right? I've tried all sorts of things over the years. I email myself stuff, you stick it in a document somewhere. but that requires you to then go back through your list and to have time to go back through your list. So what we've built now is a way that the list comes to you rather than the other way around.
This doesn't exist. This system makes sense. You're basically saying, I'm going to externally file these interesting findings during the interpretation, and we're going to follow up in some number of months. This system that you're building doesn't exist. It's surprising to me.
It is surprising to me too. It exists in pieces.
Okay.
But not in places that are convenient enough that we are using them.
Okay.
And not in the not with the nudges and the ability to pull in other things that we have in our environment that we would want.
Are you using this yet, or is this still in development?
Oh yeah, we actually so we launched it in January across the department.
Yeah.
We're close to we're about 250 faculty radiologists and probably another 100 or so trainee radiologists. And so we're not a small practice, geographically or in terms of numbers. So we launched this across the department in January. We celebrated yesterday the first 2 radiologists that have flagged over 100 cases each.
Oh, wow.
So it's used. We get compliments all the time. I mean, of all the things that we have built with this team in the last 10 plus years.
Yeah.
I think this is the one that has gotten the most acclaim internally, at least.
What if another health system learns about this flagging system that you've developed and implemented, and they want to use it?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because that is the one thing that we haven't had as much success with is sharing what we've built outside of our organization.
Okay.
And not by sharing, I mean, certainly communicating it, right? We talk about everything. We present it at meetings, we write papers, but actually packaging something up and handing it off to somebody else is tricky. And part of that, I think, is because of the way that we have to interface with the systems in the clinical workflow, right? So I'll give you an example. Our dictation system, it works fine for what we need it to do, which is, activate the dictaphone, have my templates or this department's templates, generate the report, click a button, off it goes, right? It works fine for that. If you want to go and get that report out of the reporting systems database, be prepared to grow some gray hairs. And, we figured this out the hard way, quite honestly, over the years, because these systems are not designed to make the underlying data easily accessible to the end user or to someone in the customer's organization, right? There's not a lot of transparency there. And so for all of these things that we've built, it's really hard to then package it up and give it to somebody else, because the way that we interact with our systems may not be the same way that they will need to interact with their systems. They may not even be the same systems in some cases.
Right. Is that one of the goals, though? For example, this flagging system. Would you love to share this with another healthcare organization? Is there a certain amount, or is there a certain amount of pride and ownership? Like, no, this is ours. We're going to use this, and you should come to Penn.
Ownership, but there's also, we're in academia, right? Part of being in academia is sharing of knowledge. And, honestly, Brandon, I think what's happened is everybody's built some version of this, right? Everybody's got something, maybe not everybody, but places that have the resources to build this kind of stuff, build it.
Right.
Because it doesn't exist as a product that you can purchase. In a perfect world, you could buy a product and it would be externally supported. It would be, at a price point that your practice could afford, and it would have all the features that you needed. And we are constantly in this build versus buy sort of tension. And when we have built, it is because a viable alternative doesn't exist.
Let's talk a little bit about your career path. So first of all, I was looking at your LinkedIn. You have several abbreviations in your title. I'd like to go
Not adding more, I promise. I'm done. No more letters.
I think it even went to the next line, but can we go through them and can you just describe what they are? I know what MD is. I know what PhD is. What is FSIIM?
So SIM is the Society for Imaging Informatics in Medicine.
Okay.
Uh, and I am a member of the College of Sim Fellows. I was inducted in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. Sim is it's a phenomenal organization. It's literally where I grew up professionally. It is the premier imaging informatics organization in medicine,
Mhm.
and is again not just limited to radiology, even though radiology is where it had its beginnings,
Right.
and has the biggest footprint. But certainly we have we have a dermatologist on the board, we have a pathologist on the board. I am actually rotating off the board finally after many years at the end of June. But and actually our annual meeting is next week. So that's the FSIM. FCPP, I am a fellow of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which
Oh.
is housed at the Mutter Museum on 22nd Street.
Oh,
So
really? Oh,
yeah.
okay.
And when you're inducted as a college into the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, you get to sign the log of the fellows, which dates back to I think the 1800s, maybe even earlier.
Okay.
I'm a bad historian at the moment, but
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
so I was inducted, I think, um, also at some point during the pandemic. It might have been 2022. And FAAR and FACR are actually fairly new. So the AAR is the Association of Academic Radiology. It was very recently until recently was the AUR, was the Association of University Radiologists.
Okay.
Their fellowship program is only a few years old. I was inducted in March. And FACR is actually really brand new. I only earned that one last week. The ACR is the American College of Radiology. It is the largest um, society that represents radiologists, radiation oncologists, medical physicists in the U.S. And it is one of the hardest credentials to get. You have to establish or you have to be able to demonstrate, contributions to radiology in as many areas as possible. And so, extremely honored to have that one. I did not think I would get it at this stage in my career.
Great.
So that one.
Congratulations. Any other titles on the horizon?
No, I don't think so.
I need some more. I need some abbreviations in my title. I have to work on that.
Yeah,
Um,
I think I peaked with FACR. That one was pretty special.
Tell me about your path into medicine. What led you to specialize in radiology and imaging informatics?
So as a kid, started dabbling with computers and stuff fairly early on. I mean,
Hmm.
my old Apple IIe that I had as a kid, that runs on, 220, 240 voltage is still in a box somewhere in my parents' house. Uh,
Hold on to
so
that.
yeah, I know, right? Take it somewhere and plug it in some days, see if it still runs. But I got exposed to that. I got exposed to computers fairly early on and always sort of had that interest, but also always had the interest in medicine. I spent
Okay.
more time around hospitals and doctors as a kid than I perhaps would have wanted to. But it piqued an interest there, right? And so heading into, the later years of high school, I was trying to figure out what do you do with that, right? Like,
Yeah.
where in college do you combine those two things? Because they seemed so different. And a friend of mine was a year ahead of me in school said, "Oh, well, I'm applying in biomedical engineering." I said, "Oh, what's that?
Hmm.
That sounds kind of cool. That sounds like it mixes these things that I like." So that's how I found BME. I went to Hopkins as a biomedical engineering major. Still kept that, kind of tie to computer science, and enough of it apparently that I ended up with two bachelor's degrees, so BME and CS.
Okay.
Stayed for a year, did a master's in BME, and that was where I discovered medical imaging. So
Okay.
I was very fortunate to start working in a cardiac MR lab with Elliot McVeigh, who is still very active in the field in cardiovascular imaging. Um, and met a number of very, very smart people who I still am in touch with today, who are all, leading in this space in their own right, but also learned at that point that there was something called there was the possibility to do something called an MD PhD, right?
Okay.
News to me. I mean, I just assumed I would finish undergrad, took this year to do my master's and grow up a little, quite
Yeah.
honestly, and thought, right, I'm going to apply to med school. And then one of my friends in the lab he was finishing up his PhD and going back to med school because he was an MD PhD student.
Mm-hmm.
So I give a lot of credit to Scott Reeder. He's now the department chair at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in radiology.
Hmm.
For, between him and Elliot, they really sort of set me on this career path. And so I ended up here at Penn, again, came here to work with, a leading figure in cardiovascular imaging, who unfortunately left Penn soon after I got here, but that's okay. That's how academia works. But had that, that seed of imaging kind of planted. But it was funny because I, radiology sort of has had this reputation for a long time, fairly or unfairly, of being the specialty that people go to when they don't want to talk to other people.
Oh.
When they like to hide in a dark room by themselves and, just be with the computers and not be social. And it's not a fair, we are, we are very social people. We just really like our technology too.
We talk to people. We talk to
We
people.
talk to people. I talk to people all the time.
I've also heard work-life balance. Radiology is, or is that not true? Well, you have a lot of jobs, though. You have a lot of jobs.
I have a lot of jobs, right? I won't pretend that I am good at work-life balance or that there is any
Me neither.
semblance of balance right now. I think a lot of us aren't very good at that.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that there were years in medical school, even though I came in, thinking radiology, having had this really amazing experience in the lab at Hopkins, thinking, everybody around here is telling me I should do something else. Maybe I should do something else.
Yeah.
I had people tell me at one point, you're so good with patients. Why do you want to go be a radiologist? Like it was a bad thing,
Yeah.
So, the nice thing about an MD PhD program is that it's long.
Yeah.
It's at least 7 years.
Yeah.
But it was time to figure out that, yeah, I really like this stuff. My doctoral work was with Jim G, who is still a part of the Department of Radiology here, and a fantastic mentor, and really gave me the opportunity to kind of grow both my technical expertise, but also realize that, yeah, radiology was for me. This was the specialty that I wanted. So then I finish MD PhD, I start residency, and I'm thinking, I'm gonna keep doing the same sort of research I was doing in my PhD, this sort of quantitative image processing stuff. And I had no idea what imaging informatics was. I'd never heard of it. I was sitting on my musculoskeletal radiology rotation one day as first year resident. So first year residency, every 4 weeks you're doing something different. It's a lot like medical school in that way. You get to the end of 4 weeks, you think, oh, I'm pretty good.
Yeah.
I understand something. Friday ends, Monday rolls around, you're right back to square one on some new thing. So
New learning curve.
Very early in my MSK rotation, sitting at the workstation. The attending radiologist of the day, so the faculty member that I'm working with, comes in. He sits 90 degrees to me, so his back is to me. Comes in, sits down. I know who he is because he is renowned in our department, and I have known of him since he was a resident, right? So I know who he is. He doesn't know who I am, or at least so I thought. He looks over his right shoulder at me. He doesn't say hello, doesn't introduce himself. He just says, so I hear you know how to code. That was the start of my informatics career, was that moment. And that individual who is, to this day, a mentor and a friend, is Woojin Kim, internationally known in imaging informatics. And I have a new role with the American College of Radiology. And so we get to work pretty closely together again, which is really great. Because I still am learning a ton from Woojin. But he and Bill Boone, who was also one of my other attendings in residency, good friend and colleague to this day, they mentored me, and I was so fortunate that I started residency at the time when the two of them and Kurt Langlotz and Steve Horry were all here in Penn Radiology, very active in informatics, and really opened doors for me. And so I jumped in head first and Fast forward a decade and some, and here we are.
So it's because you knew how to code.
It didn't hurt.
It didn't hurt.
Didn't hurt. It's
How
not
did
a
you?
requirement, but it was the thing that sort of set me apart from my
Yeah.
co-residents at the time, because at the time, this is now upwards of 15 years ago, right? That
Yeah.
was not common. Now
Now it's
it's
common.
it's
Yeah.
far more common.
Sure.
But at the time it was something unique.
So then how did you get into cardiovascular imaging specifically?
And that was there from the days back at Hopkins with Elliot in the lab,
Okay.
because we were a cardiac MRI lab.
Okay.
And so I had learned about that from a clinical standpoint. I'd learned about it from a research and a technical standpoint. And I thought about other subspecialties
Yeah.
of radiology along the way, but it was sort of like with just radiology in general, it was what I liked and it was what I knew. And that's how I ended up here.
Can we talk about AI?
Sure. It's what I talk about every day.
So you've been a big part of the conversations around AI in radiology. How is AI currently used within radiology?
It depends on where you are
Okay.
and where you practice. So there's sort of the worst kept secret about, narrow AI, very specific use case AI in radiology right now. And that is that it doesn't work as well as we need it to work a lot of times.
Okay.
And so, there are practices that are using a ton of AI. So they're using it as a triage tool to identify critical findings and bump those cases to the top of the radiologist's work list.
I see.
They are using it as a diagnostic aid so that it can do, some measurements perhaps, or it can identify lung nodules that we talked about earlier in the conversation.
Mhm.
There is a lot of NLP in radiology as well. So
Oh,
again, for follow-up recommendations, I am sure there's AI on the billing side. I'm just not as, exposed to it
right.
as others might be. Um, and now with LLMs and foundation models, we're trying to, we are really sort of at the precipice of looking at practice in a different way. It's cool and it's scary. And, I think the thing that we all keep coming back to is that at least today where we're sitting, the technology is not ready for autonomous use in radiology. There is
Okay.
one FDA cleared autonomous AI for medical imaging, and that is right now for diabetic retinopathy.
Oh,
So you can get a retinal image, the AI will analyze it, and the result of the inference is either you might have signs of diabetic retinopathy, go see a retinal specialist.
mhm.
Or, you know what, you look good, make sure you go see your ophthalmologist for your annual checkup. So it's sort of a low risk decision
I
point,
see.
right?
Okay.
For a lot of what we have in medical imaging right now, there's AI for large vessel occlusion for stroke, essentially, for acute
Mhm.
stroke. And there are, sometimes it works very well. There are definitely times where, the AI said yes and the patient got treated, but actually didn't need to be treated because once the human radiologist looked at the images, they realized, oh, this is actually what's going on and this is not the right treatment for it. So there are still too many instances where you need a human in the loop.
Yeah.
Is it going to be like that forever? I don't think so. I think
Right.
there are going to be instances where we can start to do something a little bit more like what my colleagues in pathology and lab medicine do. They're not sitting there running every blood smear by hand. There's a great deal of automation. It is closely monitored and regulated, and it is more of a human on the loop, if you will, right?
Okay.
The systems are good enough to say, hmm, I can't process this sample, or I'm getting conflicting signals. I need to bump this to the human. And so there's oversight and regulation around that. We don't have that yet, where the technology is not at the point where we can do that in radiology. We
Okay.
will probably get there someday, but we're not there today.
I think
Um,
I think I had this image of, at least like you mentioned, triaging, like that all imaging went through some type of AI filtering. It would do like an initial interpretation, and then that would be provided to the radiologist to then take that AI interpretation and do whatever. with it. Use it, not use it. It could
Yeah.
raise flags like that. That was my image.
Yeah, we're not there yet.
Okay.
Foundation models will get us closer.
Yeah.
In fact, at the ACR last week, we did a challenge where folks had to we presented AI generated reports and human generated reports, and we asked radiologists
Okay.
to tell us which ones were clinically acceptable.
Yeah.
And the AI performed better than you would think, but it did
Yeah.
not outperform the humans. And but it's really interesting the kind of stuff you can do now with foundation models and with LLMs. But we're not to that point. And part of the reason, certainly in the US, is that we're not to that point is because the FDA hasn't figured out how to regulate this technology yet.
Okay.
And so there is regulation. There's the 510(k) clearance process for class 2 devices that for software as a medical device as
Yeah.
well. So for some of the AI that we use, but they're still figuring out what to do with foundation models because that kind of takes it up a step.
How should radiologists be approaching the integration of AI tools into their workflow? What should they consider?
Actively and carefully.
Yeah.
So this is one thing that, a lot of people come to me and say, I'm not technical. You don't have to be technical.
Yeah.
Your contribution as the domain expert is invaluable right now because a lot of times what's happening is that, AI is being built without the input of the end user. And if you are building a solution and you don't understand the environment in which it's going to be used, and you don't understand the the limitations and the challenges and honestly the clinical task, you're
Yeah.
not going to build something that is useful to me as a
Yeah.
radiologist. And so, I every time I talk about this stuff, I say, you have to be engaged. We have to have a say in how this is deployed for our patients because we're responsible for our patients, and we can't let someone who doesn't understand how care delivery works build solutions for care delivery because they're
Yeah.
not going to solve the problems that exist.
Where's the biggest opportunity for the usage of AI? Is it in the interpretation of the imaging or anywhere along that process that you described earlier?
There's so many things that we do that I left out of that description.
Yeah, I'm sure.
The interpretive task is the easy part.
It is. Okay.
I the easy part, right?
Yeah,
For the
sure.
for the
For,
clinical domain expert, that is what I am trained to
for
do.
you,
That's what
maybe. Yeah.
my colleagues are trained to do, right?
Yeah.
We spent the prime years of our lives learning how to do this job.
Right.
We are good at this job. But we have to do all kinds of other things to even get to the part where we get to do the thing that we're good at. So, um, I cardiac MRI again is the example I keep coming back to because it's the one I know best. But there are many analogous examples. I can spend anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes searching through the EHR to figure out why that patient is here today for cardiac MR, what the clinical question was, what led them to even get that study ordered, what other workup they've had that's relevant, what the cardiologist typically who ordered it is even looking for,
Okay.
what they already know about the patient. I am a very inefficient search engine, right? AI should be able to go through the medical record
Right.
and tee all that up for me. And we are finally amazing. It's 2025. We are finally at the point where our EHR vendors are building prototypes for EHR summarization into the product.
Okay.
Um, there's still a lot of concern of, well, where, we've encouraged them to build it in such a way that it shows its work, right? So it will
Yeah.
say, well, here's this piece of information. Here's the note or the test result I got it from. So you can validate
Hmm.
uh, those sorts of things. Because again, the autonomous piece it's not quite there yet. And maybe it might get there, but it's not quite there yet.
I imagine that validation would take just as much time
And
as
that's
getting the
that's exactly,
information
yes.
yourself.
You hit the nail on the head. And we need AI to get to the point where it is good enough and we trust it enough
Yeah.
that we don't have to cross check every bit. So I've started making the analogy to activation energy. take everybody back to freshman year chemistry, right?
Mhm.
So you have a chemical reaction. You want to go from reactants to products, and there is a hoop, there's a hump you have to get over, which is the activation energy. Without AI, that exists now. The job of AI should be to decrease it, or in the perfect world, eliminate it,
Yeah.
so that it can actually start to make us more efficient. But anytime you put a new AI into the workflow, that activation energy exists again.
Let's talk about data. So, what types of data are you typically working with in radiology? You have images, you have patient records, you have reports. What else is there?
Yeah. And we have, the Penn Medicine has a biobank. So we have a lot of additional samples that you can connect up to all of the other data you just described. Because I think that's the important thing to remember is just because it's radiology doesn't mean it's all pixel data. In fact, hardly at all.
Yeah.
The pixel data is just part of it. There's a whole lot of text data, which is why there's so much NLP in
Okay.
the environment. There is the biobank data, but theoretically there could be other data, right? There could be data from wearables, there could be
Mm.
geospatial data. We don't directly work with that, but you can imagine building AI for certain use cases where that becomes relevant.
And how are you managing that data and analyzing that data? Like, what are some of the technologies you're using? If you look at a patient's journey, right, you have their historical records, you have their radiology imaging, you have their report. How are you analyzing all of this?
I'll tell you, even before you can get to the point of analyzing it, you have to get it.
Yeah,
That is the hard part because, and we are no exception to this. Data is siloed in healthcare
I've
organizations,
heard that.
right? I'm in radiology. I can get to the report data.
Yeah,
My colleagues in pathology, they can get to the pathology report data. Thankfully,
right.
we have a good collaboration in that we can share our data.
Yeah,
The data in the EHR, that's another silo. And so the hardest part with any project that we start, any innovation that we start, is getting the right data out of the right systems and creating that separate external database. And at that point, we're using a variety of things. I have the core team is using sort of web-based technologies because a lot of what they're doing is application building.
hmm.
My research folks are typically using Python and Jupyter Notebooks.
Okay.
We have internal LLMs that are HIPAA compliant. So we can use various flavors of GPT to do
Oh,
things there. We have, local instances of things like llama if we want to do that. We have to be careful because we're dealing with protected health information. So whenever possible, the data, the PHI does not leave the organizational firewall. We use systems, fully within the firewall to keep that data protected.
yeah.
Uh, if and when we are getting to work with de-identified or fully anonymized data, even then, like, the llama instance we have is on an internal
Right.
GPU. So that we just, even if the data is de-identified, we just don't have to worry about potential data compromise in that way. So it's and when there are a variety of commercial tools that the enterprise is making available now as well.
Is there a 360-degree view of a patient? Can I see all information for one patient in one place?
Wouldn't that be great? That'd be amazing.
Doesn't
I,
exist.
you know, it
Everything. I want to see the historical records for the last 10 years for this patient. I want to see all imaging. I want to see all reports in one place. Is that currently possible?
so you can see just about all of it for anything they've had done at this organization.
Oh,
If you want to
yeah.
see it, if you want to see records of care from other
Yeah,
organizations,
right.
it gets a little trickier. Some
Yeah.
of that is much more available to us now than it was even 5 years ago.
Okay.
But just because it's available doesn't mean that it's complete
Yeah.
or that it is formatted in a way that is even remotely useful. There's a lot of scrolling through unnecessary fluff to get to maybe a nugget that's buried in there somewhere. But that's the problem, is that, healthcare occurs at multiple sites. I mean, just even in Philadelphia, right? We have multiple hospitals, we have multiple health systems. Patients don't necessarily always stick to one. It would be a lot easier if they did, but I
Right.
understand that there are many
Right.
reasons why they don't or can't, quite honestly. And so that's where it gets tricky, is even within
Yeah.
organizations, data is siloed, and certainly between organizations, data is not as easily shared.
So you teach.
I do.
What courses do you currently teach?
So I teach the residents and fellows, which is sort of, within the Department of Radiology, and then in the MCIT online program for Penn, I teach a course on imaging informatics, and
Okay,
that's a half credit course. We
yeah.
started a couple years ago. It's actually running right now,
Yeah.
and it's a neat way to bring a lot of what I do day to day to a different audience, because these are predominantly non-medical folks,
Okay.
and learning about how they can apply their technical expertise in healthcare and in imaging informatics specifically.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I'm a little bit familiar with the course. So it's in the MCIT program. What kind of prerequisites do I need to take that course? Like, do I just need to know how to program? Do I need to know
Yeah.
anything about radiology,
Nope.
medicine, anything at all?
Nope. But comfort with Python is really all you need, because there are some programming assignments.
Yeah.
Everything else is presented. It's a steep learning curve. I won't lie. It's a
Yeah.
lot in 7 weeks. But we cover the breadth of imaging informatics in that time.
So what will I be able to do at the end of that course?
So at the end of that course, you'll have a better appreciation for some of the more technical aspects of healthcare, specifically as they pertain to imaging. And really, I will admit, with a heavy focus on radiology, because that's the part of imaging that I
Yeah.
know best. But you'll have an appreciation for where technical skills are valuable, where how standards and interoperability play a role, where AI is starting to come into the workflow, and really, a better understanding and appreciation of that workflow and the complexity of that workflow.
You've mentored a lot of students, residents, fellows. What core skills do you think future radiologists need most?
I think one thing is a core skill that they already have, right, is a curiosity for what's coming next,
Mhm.
um, an acceptance that their careers will not look the same in 10 or 20 years as they do today,
Right.
and a willingness to participate in that process and to be able to, share their voice and have a say in what that looks like for themselves and for our patients.
Are you ready for the lightning round?
Let's do it.
30 seconds each.
Okay.
A tool or platform you can't live without.
Slack and ChatGPT.
ChatGPT always comes up.
Yeah.
One myth about AI and radiology you wish more people understood.
That it is not the solution to all our problems.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. The sooner we all get comfortable with that,
Yeah.
the faster we'll make progress.
A recent paper, book, or article that's influenced your thinking.
I am in the very, very early pages of Quit by Annie Duke. It
Okay.
was recommended by a colleague who said it really changed the way that he approaches a lot of things. So I want to see what this change is, but I can't tell you what it is yet. Not far enough into the book.
Okay. Quitting as it relates to what?
Anything,
Okay.
anything and everything. And so Annie Duke is a very successful poker player.
Okay.
Uh, and she talks, the book
Oh,
is all about how to let go of things that essentially let go of things that don't serve you professionally as well as personally.
oh, I like that. What's your favorite band right now?
I am old school when it comes to music. I listen the same thing plays in my car every day. So he's a singer-songwriter from the UK named Ollie Murs.
Oh,
And the thing I really like about it is every song is different. One is some sort of sappy ballady love song. The next minute he's rapping. Then there's, bandstand. There's, I mean, you name it. There, every genre of music possible is in his catalog, which is why it's fun for me, because I have very eclectic taste in music.
yeah. I just looked them up. I'm going to check it out. Thank you.
Check it out.
A hobby or activity you enjoy outside of medicine.
My kids. I have two girls, 9 and 3. They don't
Mm.
stop moving. Um,
Oh,
But I will say that if I had not become a radiologist, I might have become a photographer. And
Really?
I don't reach for the old camera nearly as much as I used to. I wish I'd learned to use it better than I did, but yeah, clearly an visual imaging theme
Yeah,
there.
that is
Yeah.
interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was great. I learned a lot.
I'm glad. I had fun.
I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. See
Have a
ya.
great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.